We have a small mountain right in the center of our city. It's laid out like a pleasant city park where people gather around the small pond at the top on hot summer days, and in winter skiers can do their favorite thing without having to brave annoying traffic to escape the madness of the city. But it was not a warm July day or a sunny and crisp January morning when I, Christian Harvey, 29, was found sitting on a bench that day. And I wasn't there to enjoy a walk or a good book. I just stared mindlessly at the gray, foggy Montreal landscape on a gloomy November day, contemplating the inevitable end of my marriage. 4 weeks earlier, I was returning from a grueling 2-week trip to Europe, where I had finally secured the long-awaited signature of one of my company's largest clients on a contract that would employ half of our employees for just over 18 months. I am a technical sales representative for a specialty engineering firm. The night before, I spoke to my boss. To say that Mr. Roy was pleased with the news would be to grossly underestimate his reaction. He looked forward to meeting me in his office the following Monday morning and promised that my bank account would increase significantly once the generous bonus he had prepared for me was credited. Since it was Friday, he told me to take my wife to our favorite restaurant, not to skimp on the menu and wine, and that the entire bill would be his. As soon as I finished talking to my boss, I called Sophie, my wife of 5 years, to tell her the wonderful news and ask her to book a nanny to look after our 2-year-old daughter, Melody, my little angel. I got to her voicemail, so I left a message trying not to sound too excited. In fact, I almost giggled. Can you imagine? The guy giggles. And an engineer, too. I couldn't wait to get on the plane in the morning. If I could push it to make it take off faster, I'm sure I would. I missed my wife, and the upcoming evening promised to be perfect. I knew exactly how I wanted it to end. Hello, darling. Here comes the messenger of great news. Proud of a job well done. With these words, I greeted her when I entered the house at the end of the day. Not bad for an engineer, I thought, considering that we, as a rule, are not distinguished for the ability to decorate our words with flowers and birdsong. People expect a certain level of blandness from my professional colleagues. In the kitchen, Sophie responded in a sad voice. It was strange. She was usually a little whirlwind of energy, always enthusiastic and ready to party. I expected her to rush to the front door after 2 weeks of forced separation. The living room was dark, and given how quiet the house was, it was clear that Melody was sleeping. Another strange thing, it was late for her nap. Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of red juice in front of her. Strange. She hated this strange juice that we bought just for Melody. She was clearly crying, and her eyes were even redder than juice. "Hey, my love, what's wrong?" I asked, trying to hug and kiss her. She turned away and refused my hug. She started crying again. Unable to speak, she motioned for me to sit down. She continued to sob. I tried to stroke her hand, but she wouldn't let me. She seemed desperate for reassurance, but she rejected all my attempts, so I just sat there, worried and perplexed. Her sobs finally subsided. She put her hand on mine and looked me straight in the eyes. "This morning, I woke up naked in another man's bed." "Whoa! What? What did you just say?" "I said I spent last night with another man, and yes, I had sex with him." She could barely finish her sentence because she started crying again. I collapsed into a chair. It took me a full minute to begin to process what my wife had just told me. Sophie held her head in her hands and cried quietly. "I'm so sorry, Chris. I didn't mean for this to happen at all. I don't know what happened to me. Maybe I shouldn't have drunk so much wine. I lost control." "Who?" I asked. I was surprised by the anger in my voice. "His name is Daniel Levesque. He's a friend of Chantal's from school. We had a meeting with some fellow teachers last night, like we do every Thursday when Friday is a day off. This guy joined us at the bar. I've never met him before. He somehow managed to seduce me and was probably as drunk as I was. I don't quite remember how I ended up at his house. Everything turned against me when I woke up at 10 in the morning." And she cried again. I felt the anger growing inside me every minute. I completely forgot about signing the contract and my bonus. It's amazing how quickly a great mood can be destroyed in a few minutes. I stood up, grabbed my coat and keys. "I need fresh air," I said. "No, stay here," my wife shouted. "Excuse me? What makes you think you'll tell me what to do or not do?" "I'll leave," she answered timidly. "My dad is on his way to pick me up. I texted him when I heard you drive up. He should be here in a few minutes. I'm spending the weekend at my parents' place. I'll be back Sunday night." "Will you spend the weekend with your parents or with your lover?" I asked with disgust. "Chris, I know you're upset, and if I were you, I'd be upset too, believe me. But I can assure you that I have no intention of seeing that guy again. It was a one-time mistake." "Where's Melody, by the way?" "She's already at my parents' place. I took her there earlier in the day so you and I could talk without interruption. She'll be back with me on Sunday." "Okay, so you've already decided to leave and take our daughter with you?" "Wow, I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd brush me aside so easily," I replied, sarcastically. Sophie took it in stride. "Chris, I'm not leaving you. Leaving you is the last thing I want to do, believe me. And I will never ever do anything to keep Melody away from you." I saw her father's car pull up to the curb. "I love you, Chris. I love you much more than you know. It was a mistake, and I sincerely apologize. I'm going with Melody to my parents because I know you. I know that you need a couple of days to think and absorb what I just told you, or get drunk, or take revenge." She barely had time to finish her last sentence before she began to cry again. She grabbed her bag, which had been near the front door the whole time, and which I hadn't noticed when I walked in, and in a moment, she was in her father's car. "Take revenge," I muttered, as if that would help in any way. "See? I hurt you just like you hurt me. Who's the winner now?" As if I should have acted so childish. I still had my coat on, but I decided that if I wanted to have a few beers, it would be better to do it at home than to be a jerk to everyone in the local bar and risk my life, or the life of someone else, by returning after drinking too much. I ended the evening having only had one beer and not even eaten dinner. My thoughts were confused. I didn't know what to do, and I was so tired after these 2 weeks of travel that I simply couldn't formulate two coherent ideas. I was angry, yes, but I felt some sense of resignation. It was like I knew it was going to happen, sooner or later. I met Sophie Gilbert when I was studying at CEGEP. This is an intermediate level between high school and university that only exists here in Quebec. We were in the same philosophy class last semester, and random luck brought us together to write the 4 papers required to pass the course. Our first work meeting took place in the student cafe on Wednesday afternoon, and when we started discussing the first question of the assignment, the conversation took on a life of its own, and we ended up recreating the entire world without making any real progress on the assignment. Long story short, we started dating the following weekend. Sophie went to Concordia University and got a degree in mathematics to become a teacher, and I went to Polytechnic to get a degree in biomedical engineering. Since both universities were in the city, we moved in together 2 years into our relationship and got married the summer after I graduated. Melody joined us 3 years later, and for 2 months, we actively worked to add a second heir to the Harvey Gilbert family. We were a happy couple and a happy family. Sophie and I were not only lovers and spouses, but she was my best friend, and I was her best friend. Well, until a few hours ago. Jet lag eventually took its toll, and I went up to our bedroom a few minutes before 9 p.m. My thoughts were still a chaos of unresolved issues, but I would have plenty of time the next day. I woke up around 4:30 a.m. the next morning, completely unable to fall back to sleep. There was a text message on my phone from Sophie. "I love you, Chris. I love you so much." She left it after I went to bed the night before. I decided to ignore him for now. Sometimes the problems you create by remaining silent are better manageable than those that arise when you speak up too soon. After my usual morning routine, I made some coffee, grabbed a pencil and a notepad, and started jotting down my thoughts about the whole situation. I've always found that writing down what randomly passes through my mind and rereading it the next day is the best method for arriving at clear ideas. Do I still love Sophie? It's not even a question. Of course I still love her. Love is not a switch that can be turned on or off in a second. Will I be able to forgive her? Would I be better off staying or leaving? Will I be able to trust her again? If I stay with her, how will I feel about leaving for my next assignment away from home? As I asked myself these questions, one thought quickly grew in my mind and overshadowed everything else. I, too, have had many opportunities in the past to have a drink or dinner with a woman at a hotel bar or restaurant, and I'm sure that if I had gone for it, quite a few of them would have ended up in my hotel room or me in theirs. But I never went for it. Some of them were quite attractive, some were real beauties, but I always managed to behave myself. And honestly, it didn't even take much effort. How could Sophie not resist? Was this guy Daniel that much hotter than me? Was it because she didn't love me as much as I loved her? Did she not consider our marriage worthy of resisting external temptations as much as I did? And why the hell didn't she let me react yesterday? She immediately interrupted me and ran off to her parents. Yes, what a mature and productive way to handle a delicate situation. I just hoped this wasn't the type of behavior she teaches to her high school students. I made myself a proper breakfast. After almost a week in France eating croissants and fruit preserves, eggs and bacon would be more than welcome. And when it was late enough in the morning to start the lawnmower without my neighbors thinking I was declaring war on them, I started mowing the lawn for the last time for the season. I spent the rest of the day running errands and taking care of my laundry. On the way home, I stopped for sushi and had an early dinner. As I sat down to eat, I received another text from Sophie. "Are you okay, Chris? I'm so sorry. I love you." I had calmed down a little since she dropped her bombshell on me the day before. Perhaps she was right after all. I needed some alone time to heal my wounds. I tried to come up with a thoughtful response, but I wasn't ready yet. "I love you too, Soph. I just don't know how to handle the situation." She responded with a series of crying emojis. "We'll talk tomorrow. I miss Melody. Please don't come home too late." Again, I went to bed early. I was looking forward to meeting my daughter and talking to Sophie. Sunday passed without any special events. Sophie's father brought her and Melody home early after dinner. I went out to meet them. I took Melody in my arms and hugged her for a full minute. She started mumbling about what she had with her grandparents. My father-in-law hugged me. "I'm so sorry to see you in this situation, Chris. Please don't be too hard on Sophie." "She feels very guilty," Norman said. "Besides, to be honest, I wasn't too sympathetic to her. And neither was her mom." He added with a tense face, "I'm calmer than I was yesterday, Norm. I'm not going to yell at her. I just want to understand and figure out how to move on with my life." He patted me on the shoulder, kissed his daughter and granddaughter, and left. I read Melody a bedtime story and put her to bed. Sophie was waiting for me in the kitchen with a glass of wine. "No wretched red juice today?" I asked. No. I was still hungover on Friday. I thought I'd never drink alcohol again in my life. I feel better now. Do you want some?" I took myself a beer instead of wine. I sat down with her in the living room, waiting for her to start a conversation. "Chris, I love you and I'm so sorry." "Yes, I know, Soph. You're sorry. I understand. You've told me this about 1,200 times. I just want to know what prompted you to do this. Is it because you're no longer satisfied with what we have? Are you in love with this guy?" No, absolutely not," she almost screamed. "I admit the guy is handsome, and he talks well, and he's fun to be around, but I don't love him. I love you, Chris." "So why?" She continued to play with her glass. "I don't know. I think I was out of my mind because of the wine. I really missed you, and I guess I started to feel lonely." "Damn, Sophie, this is nonsense. Damn, I was almost on my way home. You could have waited a few more hours and I would have been here," I screamed. "I never said it was rational. I hate myself for being so weak." Sophie's voice was almost inaudible. Did you use protection at least? Sophie looked at me for 3 seconds and then burst into tears. I guessed my answer. Sophie was now crying so loudly that she woke Melody. I took the opportunity to leave the kitchen and went upstairs to comfort my little daughter. I returned to the kitchen about 10 minutes later. Sophie's loud crying turned into light sobs. If this guy gets you pregnant, it's over between us, Soph. I'm not going to raise someone else's baby, I said, perhaps a little too aggressively. Sophie looked absolutely devastated. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but I was so angry at her that I almost took pleasure in seeing her suffer. Oh, one more thing. Until we're sure you're not pregnant, I'll be sleeping in the guest room downstairs in the basement. Sophie continued to sob and didn't say a word. It was clear that she had reached the point of pain saturation. I went up to our bedroom, collected a few clothes and toiletries, and brought them downstairs. She was still crying, holding her head in her hands, when I passed her on the way to the basement. The next morning, I barely spoke to Sophie. I dropped Melody off at daycare and went to work. Mr. Roy was smiling from ear to ear as he sat down in my office, eager to know all the details of the negotiations and to know how much I had enjoyed the private celebration with my wife. His bubble of happiness quickly deflated when he saw my depressed mood. "Here's the bill for our dinner at that fancy restaurant on Friday," I said, making a hand gesture as if I were handing him a piece of paper. "The total cost is an astronomical $0, courtesy of a creep named Daniel Levesque." Mr. Roy looked at me like a deer at oncoming headlights. I fell into a chair, sighed, and began to tell him the wonderful story of my personal life. "What are you going to do?" he asked when I finished. "I'll continue to sleep in the basement bedroom until we find out if she's pregnant. If she's pregnant with his child, I'll find a family lawyer and file for divorce. If she's not pregnant, I'll find a good marriage counselor and see if we can still save our relationship. I may have to take a few hours off here and there in the coming days or weeks." After assuring me that this was not a problem at all, he left my office, not forgetting to repeat his sincere thanks and congratulations for a job well done in Europe. I closed the door and sank into my chair, still not sure I could make it through the rest of the day. Evening socializing at home was minimal. When I got home at 6 p.m., Sophie had already fed Melody dinner and was finishing making ours. It was a sad evening. We barely exchanged words. The rest of the week was about as cold as the next one. Sophie's cycle was always regular and precise, like a Swiss watch, so I had a pretty good idea of when she was expecting her period to start. I saw how nervous she was the next day, and it didn't improve the day after. By then, I pretty much knew everything was settled, so 3 weeks after that fateful Friday, I visited the family lawyer. The lawyer explained that the best course of action would be to file for divorce, followed by a DNA test after the birth of the child. If the baby turned out to be mine, which was virtually impossible, then I could simply decide to go back to her, and that would stop the procedure. If the test confirms that the child is not mine, then I will not be legally obligated to pay or do anything for the child, and will be able to file for divorce on grounds of adultery and not have to wait for the required 1-year separation. I agreed with his proposal, and he said that the documents would be ready next week. I saw that Sophie was doing everything she could to put off taking the pregnancy test, but I didn't say a word. I decided it was her problem now. 2 days later, on Wednesday, I came home to find Sophie in tears. I didn't say a word. I could tell from her look that she knew that I understood everything. "It could still be your baby, you know?" I started laughing. An evil, sarcastic laugh that even I found disgusting. "Seriously, Sophie? The last time we had sex was a week before my trip to Europe in September. Then you got your period, and then I left. So there's no way I can be a father. I suggest you contact your boyfriend and tell him good news." "He's not my boyfriend!" she screamed. And then, more quietly, almost choked, "I met this guy once. I haven't even seen him since I slept with him." "Oh, it's your life, Sophie. I let you manage your relationships as you see fit. It's absolutely none of my business." I went to my room downstairs and sent a text message to my boss saying I would take Thursday and Friday off. I'll admit, I let the bottle of tequila console me a little that night. The next day, I visited several apartments near our house that I had found in recent days. I signed a lease for one of them on Friday morning. I took the subway downtown to my lawyer's office in the afternoon to pick up my divorce papers. When I left his office, I felt completely lost. No, not lost. It was more like I was being carried away by a wave that was ready to destroy everything I had, and that could not be stopped. I was lost in my thoughts when I realized that I had passed the metro station and was walking towards Mont Royal. Returning to the beginning of this story. I got home. Well, rather I should say I got home around 8 p.m. I went to the nearest pub where I ate a burger and drank beer. I knew that Sophie had written to me, probably because she was starting to worry, but I decided not to read her messages. "Where have you been? Are you okay?" she asked. She looked genuinely concerned. "Here, this is your copy of the divorce agreement," I told her, handing her the distinctive envelope. She closed her tear-stained eyes and sat down without taking the envelope. "You will see that everything is done by the book. This is a completely fair agreement that includes everything that concerns Melody. We will have joint custody, so no child support is required from either party. I will also pay you child support. You can leave the house, and I will continue to pay my share for 5 years, which will give you more than enough time to save up and find a new place. As for your other child, I suggest you negotiate with your father. It's not my problem and I won't pay for it," I said ruthlessly. "Oh, and I found an apartment about 2 kilometers from here. I'll start moving some things over the weekend. I'll leave you with all the furniture we've bought together over the years, except for what's in the downstairs bedroom where I've been sleeping for the last 3 weeks. I will also take back what was mine before our marriage. My brother will come here tomorrow with his pickup truck to move my things to my apartment. I suggest you leave on business or take Melody to your parents tomorrow morning. It will make things easier for everyone." I saw Sophie crushed. I had to do my best not to cry myself. I still loved her. I just couldn't get over what she did. And even if I couldn't raise another man's child. It wasn't even up for discussion. I went to Melody's room, took her sleeping little body in my arms, and kissed her forehead, telling her I would see her in a week. I couldn't stop myself from crying. Being separated from my daughter for a week out of 2 will be the hardest for me. I put her back in her crib and went to my basement room to start packing my things. When I came into the kitchen the next morning around 8:30, I saw a note from Sophie saying Melody and her were at her parents'. She added that she loved me and that she was devastated by what was happening. I knew she felt this way, but I simply didn't see any other way out. A few hours later, we officially began living at different addresses. Sophie later visited my lawyer the following week and signed all the documents without any changes. And so we officially began our separate lives. Jacob was born on Canada Day, July 1st. The lawyer sent an official request for a DNA test. Without any surprises, the test confirmed that I am not the boy's father. This way, the divorce could be finalized on the grounds of infidelity, which meant I didn't have to wait until November, a year after the separation, to make it final. In retrospect, I could have waited until November and it wouldn't have made any difference. But for some twisted reason, calling out the cheating was like announcing to the entire planet that Sophie was a cheater, and that brought me comfort. This caused her even more pain and tears. Was I an asshole? Don't know. Maybe. A couple of weeks later, when I brought Melody back from my week with her, Sophie told me that the DNA test showed that Jacob was Daniel Levesque's child. She felt terrible telling me this. I think this was a final admission for her that she had done me wrong, and I could see how incredibly embarrassed she was. "I'm so sorry, Chris. I know I've said it over and over again, but there are no words strong enough to tell you how terrible the situation makes me feel. This baby should have been yours." I couldn't explain why, but I felt some relief when I heard that this Daniel guy really was the father. At least she wasn't hopping from bed to bed playing Russian roulette and ending up pregnant by someone she didn't even remember. But again, I surprised myself that I even cared. I half expected Daniel to move in with Sophie and for them to become a couple. So I hired a private detective agency to get as much information as possible about this guy. not to spy on him or anything like that, or even to assess the true nature of the relationship between him and my ex-wife. But I expected this guy to be spending a lot of time around Melody, and I needed to know that he was a good guy, that my daughter was safe around him. The private investigator found out that he was 34 years old, several years older than Sophie and me. He was a freelance book editor specializing in elementary school textbooks. I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy when I found out that this guy was available. In one of the photographs, he had a light beard. For some reason, he looked familiar, like someone I saw from time to time, but I couldn't remember where or when. Was he someone who had been hanging around Sophie for a long time, much longer than she told me, or much closer than she was willing to admit? It didn't help calm my anxiety. Was I jealous? No, of course not. There was no reason to be jealous, as Sophie and I were on our way to a formal divorce. Nevertheless, I pushed the thought out of my head. The report said he had an estranged brother who lived in Coudjouac, in the far north of Quebec. The investigator pursued him for 2 weeks. Daniel went to see Sophie every day, but did not move in with her. He didn't even stay overnight. Well, maybe they weren't a couple after all. The months passed. Sophie took Melody and Jacob to her parents' house for Christmas Eve. On Christmas Day, I went to Sophie's to pick up Melody and came face to face with Daniel for the first time, who was just finishing getting Jacob ready to take him with me. I was still incredibly angry at him, and he sensed it. And there was this extremely unpleasant feeling of familiarity that I felt, and which, apparently, he felt too, when I took off my frozen glasses. However, I was able to shake his hand politely and exchange pleasantries, although all I wanted to do was kick him in the groin so hard that Jupiter would get 2 new moons. I never realized how similar you two are. It's almost creepy, Sophie said casually, a few seconds after Daniel and Jacob left. This comment lit a couple of light bulbs in my head. That explained the strange feeling of familiarity. Could we be related? Hardly. The DNA paternity test was unequivocal. There is absolutely no relationship between Jacob and I, so shared blood between me and Daniel was almost impossible. However, the similarities were striking. "Dad!" Melody shouted joyfully when she saw me going down the stairs. "Hello, my little flower," I said, taking her in my arms. "Daddy missed you so much." "Look, Dad, her name is Zaza," she said proudly, showing me her new doll. "Daniel brought it to me." It was the equivalent of 3 or 4 blows to the stomach. This guy was supposed to be my nemesis, and he bought my daughter a cute present for Christmas. I felt cheap, not even able to be even a little attached to his son, enough to look at him. Sophie and I helped Melody get dressed to go outside during this frosty Christmas season. Sophie hugged her and gave me a kiss. I saw tears well up in her eyes as Melody and I left. Christmas dinner at my parents' house was always a big deal. My mom and my dad's families always got along well and were a big group of friends. My mother's older brother and his wife were close friends of my father's only sister and her husband. They all met for the first time at my parents' wedding, and from then on, both families became a close-knit group. "You look depressed, son. Are you okay?" My father was a retired HR manager, so he was more sensitive to people's behavior than the average person. I really didn't want to get involved in a full-blown emotional investigation, but knowing my dad, I knew I had to give him some answers or he'd spend the evening worrying about me. I told him about the physical resemblance between Daniel Levesque and me, and also about my feelings about the doll he gave Melody for Christmas. Dad listened carefully, and, true to himself, was able to unravel everything for me in a few sentences. "Well, first of all, son, you got the answer to the big question of why. That night when Sophie slept with him, the fact that he was so much like you helped him overcome her defenses. What about the guilt for the fact that you didn't show warmth to his son when he brought something to Melody? Don't forget that you didn't take anything from this guy. You're not the aggressor in this situation. You have nothing to atone for. He does." My father's words work like a vaccine. They take several days to fully take effect. Over the next months, I started to feel a little more accepting of the situation, and somehow I wasn't as angry at Daniel as I had been before. The week after Jacob's first birthday, I had an interesting conversation with Melody. She was 4 years old at the time and was very articulate for her age. "Tell me, Melody, when Daniel comes to your house, does he stay long? Does he sometimes have dinner with you?" "No, he never stays. He takes Jacob and brings him back," Melody answered. "So Daniel and your mom aren't best friends?" "No, they say a few words and only about Jacob." "Is he nice to you?" I had to ask. "Yes, he always says hi and asks what I did during the week, but he never asks anymore because he doesn't stay long." "Okay. Is your mom sad after he leaves?" "Yes. She cries because she says she misses Jacob, but she cries more when you leave." We were interrupted by a knock on the front door. It was Jasmine, the daughter of the downstairs neighbors, who wanted to play with Melody. "Go play with her," I told Melody. So Sophie still hasn't gotten over me? This detail gave me guilty pleasure. I hoped she would eventually outlive me, however, because there was no way I could go back to her and raise someone else's child. At the end of the summer, we received bad news. My only living grandfather, my maternal grandfather, had to move into an institution because his Alzheimer's disease had become unmanageable. Well, unmanageable for the staff of his establishment, I must say. Since my office was located in the same part of the city as this institution, I took it upon myself to visit it at least once a week. This was supposed to reassure my mother. A few days after his appointment, I met the new nurse who would be caring for him. Her name was Roxanne. She was a short brunette, very organized and sharp in her judgment, with striking blue eyes behind massive glasses. She was very professional, but also extremely reserved, if not cold. I took it as a challenge. It took me a few weeks to get past her layered defenses, but once that happened, things worked out pretty well for us. The more I got to know her, the more I liked her. However, the fact that she was my grandfather's nurse prohibited me from trying to forge a closer relationship. Sophie's Christmas party that year fell during her week with Melody, so she asked me if I could exclusively pick Melody up on a Friday afternoon from daycare rather than at her house on a Sunday afternoon, which was our usual routine. Of course, this was not a problem. I was glad to spend more time with Melody. I went to bed a little late that Friday night because I wanted to finish watching 2 movies I had rented. I had only been lying in bed for 10 minutes when my cell phone rang. I saw that Sophie was calling. My blood almost froze. "Sophie, what happened? Are you okay?" "Chris, oh my God. Have I ever told you how sorry I am?" Her speech was somewhat slurred. When I was an engineering student in college, we said that a good party needs all 3 phases: solid, liquid, and gas. Well, Sophie's party clearly had quite the liquid phase. Or was it gaseous? "Soph, what are you talking about?" I asked, half worried, half amused. "I'm sorry I got pregnant, Chris. I still love you. You know I love you, right?" "Are you okay, Sophie? Can you get home?" "Yes, but not now. I'm a little drunk, I think." She was laughing. "Sophie, do you need me to come pick you up and take you home?" I insisted. No. Chantal's husband will come. Well, I hope he doesn't finish the whole car." She burst out laughing and hung up. I knew she still loved me, even if she never mentioned it. Was it a matter of pride? Was she still ashamed of what happened? This was something I didn't want to find out. I resisted the urge to call her the next day to see how she was doing. I didn't want her to think I was checking up on her or controlling her. Perhaps she ended the evening with someone, but it was none of my business, although the thought of it was unpleasant. Sophie called me around 1 p.m. the next day. "Hey, Chris, I see on my phone that I called you last night around 1 and I'm so sorry I woke you up. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." She sounded very shy. "It's okay, Soph. It's nothing. I just lay down after watching a couple of movies." "Oh, okay. I'm glad. I was a little drunk, I guess." "Yeah, a little," I said, laughing. "Did I tell you something that I should be ashamed of?" she asked with great hesitation. Sophie was known for losing her memory after a few drinks. "No, don't worry. You just said you were having fun. Did you make it home safely?" "Yes. Chantal's husband drove me," she replied. "Okay, fine. Well, thanks for calming me down," I said. There's one more thing I wanted to ask you. According to our schedule, you should bring Melody to me on the 23rd, because she'll be with me for the Christmas party the next day. Well, I'd really like to invite you for dinner that night. I'm sure Melody would be happy to have dinner with both her parents. This was the first time. Sophie and I were on good terms. Nice in the sense of politeness, but not friendly. We sort of tacitly agreed that it was best to keep some distance between us, even if only to make sure we weren't doing anything that might open old wounds. We haven't shared dinner since that fateful Friday 2 years ago. The fact is that I felt much better towards her than before. However, for some reason, the idea made me completely uncomfortable. I hesitated, but in the end, I decided to do it for Melody's sake. Thanks for the invitation, Sophie. I'd love to come. By the way, Jacob won't be here. Daniel won't be able to bring him in until Saturday afternoon, Sophie added. My hesitation suddenly disappeared. Was I really afraid of running into a 1.5-year-old boy? This dinner never took place. My grandfather passed away on the morning of December 23rd. I called Sophie to tell her the news. She expressed her condolences to me and understood that I was canceling dinner to be with my mother that evening. It turned out to be a rather sad Christmas time, ending with a funeral in early January. Hello, Roxana is on the line. Hi, Roxanne. This is Chris Harvey. How are you doing? I waited until the end of January to call Roxanne, not because I wasn't interested, but because I was on a business trip for over 2 weeks in January. A new Korean restaurant just opened near my office, and it's getting amazing reviews. I knew she was a true lover of Asian food. This dinner turned out to be a very enjoyable evening, although there was some awkwardness at the beginning. This was my first date with a woman other than Sophie since we started dating 12 years ago at the age of 19. To say that my experience with dating women was limited would be a gross understatement. However, the conversation soon flowed freely. The fact that my grandfather was no longer in the picture kind of opened the door to some talking points that we had never talked about. We dated a few more times, and on Valentine's Day she spent the night at my house after we had sex for the first time. It was completely different from Sophie, but I could hardly explain how. I was able to hide our relationship from Melody for several months. For some reason, I didn't want Sophie to know that I was in a new relationship, but all good things come to an end. I was at the Place des Arts one evening when we ran into Sophie's sister Natalie and her husband Mark. Natalie was a high school teacher like Sophie, but she taught French. I never knew what Mark was doing. All I knew was that he was a jerk whose specialty was making people feel uncomfortable. My relationship with Natalie was always strained, and I could never understand why. I had no choice but to greet them and introduce Roxanne. Mark mentally undressed her before making her blush, as was his habit with women. I don't know how long it took for the information to reach Sophie, but she never mentioned it to me. I saw that she seemed a little more depressed in the following weeks, but she did not make any comments about my personal life. The relationship with Roxanne became serious as soon as it became public knowledge. She was 4 years younger than me. She was in a long-term relationship that ended about 6 months before I first met her at the residence, and she had no children. She often joked about her body clock ringing as if it was the loudest sound in her life, but then admitted that at 27 she was in no rush to become a mother. We all settled into a routine, and I enjoyed a calm flow of life for a year and a half. The following summer, Roxanne and I took a trip to San Francisco, where, after a wonderful dinner at a famous fish restaurant on Fisherman's Wharf, I popped the big question to her, to which she responded with an overly excited, "Yes, yes, yes, yes," in front of all the visitors, who began to applaud and congratulate us. Melody was thrilled when Roxanne and I announced our wedding for next April. She completely lost her temper when we asked her if she would be the main flower girl. She was already imagining her dress and couldn't wait to tell all her friends at school about it. 2 weeks later, when I went to pick Melody up at her mother's, Roxanne was waiting in the car while I followed her to the door. I noticed that Sophie looked depressed. At first, I didn't connect this with my wedding announcement. As I pulled out of her driveway, I saw Sophie at the window. She probably thought I couldn't see her well, but I saw her crying. Roxanne was chatting happily with Melody, and judging by her attention to my daughter, she clearly hadn't seen Sophie. That evening I lay in Roxanne's bed, unable to sleep, each of us still living in our own place. Roxanne was already asleep. I couldn't shake the image of Sophie crying at the window. We settled into a routine again, this time all focused on getting Melody to elementary school. Sophie and I handled all the extra logistics without ever bringing up the topic of my upcoming wedding. But I felt that the situation was no longer as simple as it had become before. "Does Mom have a boyfriend?" I asked Melody one evening, trying to sound casual. No, Melody replied. "Does she sometimes go out with friends?" "Not really. She cares about me and Jacob, but she always stays at home and cries. I don't know why," was her sad response. A sudden realization hit me. Melody was 6 years old at the time. She didn't remember the day Sophie and I broke up. To her, Sophie and I were never a couple. This sudden realization almost knocked me off my feet. Sometimes we don't realize the depth of the impact our actions have on our children, simply because they perceive time differently than we do. The following week, Roxanne received great news. She had been promoted to assistant head nurse in her unit. We went out to one of her favorite restaurants one evening to celebrate this wonderful news. The only problem is that this will bring a lot of changes to my schedule. I'll still have to work evenings and some weekends, but the challenges will be different. I'll find out the new schedule after Christmas, she explained as we waited for dessert. Okay, I wanted to buy tickets for our honeymoon next week, but it's probably best to wait until you know what your new schedule will be, I answered. This turned out to be a very wise decision. I was chatting with colleagues at our Christmas party on the second weekend of December. Roxanne couldn't come with me because 2 of her colleagues were sick that day, and she had to work the night shift. The venue was a nice hotel in the city center. That Friday night, the hotel was holding 2 parties in separate rooms. The company had a very good year, and our boss, as usual, was keen to thank everyone for the success we had had. So wine and fine liquors and everything else were freely available. I was returning from the toilet when I encountered a dream. Red-haired, almost as tall as me, with the body of a siren and a smile that could melt the entire Antarctica. "Sorry, I should probably go slow with the wine, right? I'm Catherine, by the way," she said, holding out her hand. "Sorry, I should be the one apologizing. I wasn't watching where I was going. I'm Christian." I started talking to her. She was from another party, a law firm. She was a lawyer specializing in international business contracts. When I told her that I was in charge of international sales for an engineering company, the explosion began. Well, as far as an explosion can start in a conversation between a lawyer and an engineer. I took another glass from my side of the bar, and she did the same. And the conversation took a more personal turn. And we drank some more. And then we talked about, I don't actually remember. When I woke up the next day, I was stunned to realize that I was at Roxanne's. Or was this my place? Well, it doesn't matter where I was. The main thing is that she was there, lying in bed with me. This was important. "Slept well, stranger?" she asked. "Oh, wait a minute. Whose voice is this? This is not Rox." I opened one eye slightly to see a strand of flaming red hair blocking the view of the room. "Oh my God. Oh, damn. What's her name, damn?" "Yeah, Catherine, that's it." She saw my confusion on my face and started laughing. "I think you drank even more than me. Don't worry, it didn't affect your abilities. I had a great time," she said, giggling. Yes, we are. Twice." "Oh, we did it? Oh, okay, Definitely great." I expected to wake up with a terrible headache, but surprisingly I felt fine. Catherine got out of bed and went to the shower. I was still trying to remember the events of last night when she came out of the bathroom, already dressed. She gave me a kiss and told me she had a great time, but she had to hurry because it was already 9:50 and their group's breakfast was scheduled for 10 hours. "Don't worry about the room. It was my reservation, and it's already paid for at my office. I think the checkout time is 12 hours. It was a very enjoyable evening, Chris. Thank you very much." She opened the door, then turned to look at me. "By the way, don't worry, honey. I'm taking my pills," she said with a wink. And after 2 seconds, she disappeared. I showered and dressed myself, wearing the same clothes I had worn the day before, since I did not expect to stay at the hotel overnight. I was in the elevator on the way out when my phone rang. I saw that it was Roxanne, as expected at this time. I was instantly overwhelmed by a wave. No, not a wave, a tsunami of guilt. The sudden realization that I had cheated on her really hit me for the first time. I couldn't answer the call right now, but I couldn't help but answer. "Hey, honey, how was your night shift?" I said, hesitating. "Fine. Nothing particularly interesting." I could tell there was a little irritation in her voice, or maybe it was just an echo of my guilt. "How was your party? Did it end late?" she asked. "Oh, it was nice. A very good dinner," I said, and then I made the stupidest mistake I could ever make. "And no, it didn't end very late. I was home a little before midnight." She was silent for 1 or 2 seconds. "I see. Okay, I need to go. Lots of things to do today," she said with a strange intonation. "Okay, bye." It was the most awkward conversation I've ever had with her. Did she suspect something? It was impossible for her to suspect anything. She was working last night. When she works the evening shift, she almost always drives to her apartment, which is only a 5-minute drive from work, while mine is almost 30 minutes away. I had a hard time concentrating on the road on the way home. I stopped at a diner to get something to eat. I had no appetite. I felt so bad about what happened the night before, even if my memories of the evening weren't entirely clear or complete. I had a strange feeling when I returned home. It wasn't the same. I couldn't explain why, but it was a strange feeling. I found the answer when I entered my bedroom. On the bed lay a piece of paper that looked like a handwritten letter. "Chris, last night you did the second to last thing I expected you to do. You slept with another woman. And this morning, you did the last thing I could have expected. You lied to me. How did I know this? The fact is that the evening at work turned out to be very calm. My colleagues told me they could handle it. I bought a dress in case I could leave before the end of my shift. So I showered, got dressed, then went to your Christmas party to surprise you. You didn't notice me because you were busy flirting with that red-haired beast. I stayed long enough to see you and her head towards the elevator. I went home crying. I came here this morning to see if we could do something about it. I realized that you didn't even sleep here. I called you and you lied to me. You fucking lied to me. I took all my things from your apartment. I will pack your things in a box, which I will leave in the office of my house. The key to your apartment is on your bedside table. I'm amazed that you left Sophie over one night. Yes, she got pregnant, but at least she never lied to you. Rox." I read the letter 3 times. He lay down on the bed, looking at the ceiling. I couldn't think. I was stunned, saddened, disgusted by my own actions. I tried calling Roxanne. As expected, she didn't answer. We communicated a lot via Messenger. But when I tried to message her, I saw that she had already unfriended me. I sent her a text message. I asked her to talk to me, which I didn't want to explain because there was nothing to explain. There were no good reasons for what I did, but what I wanted, I needed to apologize. Then came a second wave of messages, and a third later that evening, and the fourth the next day, and another one every day that week. She never answered. I went to the residence where she worked and was told that she had taken a few days off and left specific instructions that I was not allowed to enter or talk to her. The only message I received was from her building management telling me there was a box waiting for me and I had 48 hours to pick it up or it would be disposed of. I went to her building, took the box, and tried to call Roxanne's apartment, but there was no answer. The next day, when I picked Melody up from Sophie, my mood was not at its best. It must have shown on my face because Sophie asked me if everything was okay. She looked genuinely concerned. I didn't think it was possible, but another wave of guilt washed over me at that moment. Perhaps even worse than the ones I had experienced last week. I realized that I couldn't look Sophie in the eyes. What the hell kind of hypocrite am I? The thought hit me like thunder. The wave of guilt continued to roll over me for the rest of the day. Even Melody noticed my gloomy mood. "Are you okay, Dad? You look so sad." "You're so kind, my little bird. I have a big problem to solve. So yeah, you're right, I don't feel good. But I'll be fine. Why don't you call Roxy? You're always in a good mood when she's around." "Well, I can't call her right now. It's a little complicated. I'll explain later, okay?" She looked at me with a strange look, a look that I had never seen in her big eyes. She analyzed, made conclusions, and deductions. At the same time, she felt it was better to drop the topic. Children are often much smarter than we give them credit for. After I put her to bed that night, I stayed in the living room, sipping a glass of red wine. The weird thing is that there was a part of me that missed Roxy and felt bad about her, but there was an even bigger part of me that felt bad about Sophie. Sophie drank wine and slept with Daniel Levesque while in a relationship with me. I drank beer and slept with Catherine while in a relationship with Roxanne. Was this more acceptable? Sophie slept with another man without caring about the risk of getting pregnant. I slept with another woman without caring about the risk of conceiving a child. Again, was this more acceptable? Okay, some might argue that Sophie was my wife. Okay, but I was engaged to Roxanne. Is that a big difference? No, it wasn't a real difference. The difference was that Sophie was open with me. She had the courage to be honest. But I lied to Roxana like a coward unable to face the truth. Dad, why haven't we seen Roxy all week? Melody asked Thursday night. That's all. Another turning point. This time, the decision was easier for me. I didn't lie to my daughter. I squatted down. Roxanne and I broke up, honey. That's why I've been sad all week. So you two aren't going to get married? No, honey. We won't see her again, I replied, defeated. Melody threw herself into my arms and started crying. I thought you were so excited about the upcoming wedding, she said after several minutes of sobbing. We were happy, but something bad happened. Something I can't tell you right now, but I will tell you someday, okay? Those big eyes, wet and red this time. Seeing her cry always broke my heart. She nodded. I took her in my arms. Later that evening, we snuggled up on the couch and watched Frozen for the 594th time. Then I put her to bed. Need I mention that this wasn't the most fun Christmas season I've ever had? I spent the 24th alone in my apartment because my parents were in Florida. Sophie called me on the 25th. Hey, Chris, Melody told me last night that you and Roxanne broke up. Are you okay? Yes, I'm fine. Thanks for asking. That's very nice of you, considering the circumstances. Are you alone tonight? I know it was decided that Melody will be with me on both the 24th and 25th this year, and with you on the 31st and 1st of January, because your parents are in Florida for Christmas, but we can be flexible, you know? I'm going over to some friends tonight. Why don't you join? Do you remember Caroline and Patrick? Very nice of you again, Soph. But I'm not in the mood to go to a party. I wouldn't be the best company. Plus, I have a lot to think about. Most of this is long overdue, actually. But thank you very much. And, yes, I remember them. Give them my best wishes. Okay. Don't be shy if you change your mind or want to talk, okay? Okay. Thank you very much, Soph. And Merry Christmas. I was glad that Christmas was finally over. I had to make a very important trip in January, February. It was quite a marathon. Boston, Raleigh, Dallas, Mexico City, São Paulo, Buenos Aires, and then Toronto. On the way back, I had to be away for 3 weeks. Sophie assured me that she would handle rearranging our schedule to care for Melody. I was sitting at the gate at Toronto Pearson, waiting for my last flight back to Montreal. I was watching the news on my tablet. A few days ago, a friend wrote to me that his mother had died. I took a few minutes to visit the obituary section of the newspaper. While searching for my friend's mother, I came across a face that made my jaw drop. Daniel Levesque. The announcement stated that he died as a result of an accident. I did a quick search on the news and found out that he was in a car accident 10 days ago. I wanted to call Sophie, but the airport employee had already started announcing my flight. I realized that I haven't been angry at this guy in a long time. In fact, I felt for his family. And yes, his son. I haven't seen him that often, come to think of it. I think Sophie tried to keep him away from me when I picked Melody up at her house. I got home at 7 p.m. that Friday. The next day, I had to pick Melody up early enough to have breakfast with her. I called Sophie. Hi, I just arrived. How are you? Okay. It's been a big day. Do you want to talk to Melody? She asked. No, I'll see her tomorrow. I wanted to ask how you were feeling. I saw Daniel in the obituaries. Why didn't you tell me when I called you last week? I wanted to make it clear that I could help if she needed it, but I didn't want her to feel like I was blaming her for not telling me. Why did I have to tell you about him? He's just the father of my second child. He's not my boyfriend. How many times do I have to say this? She answered sharply. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean anything like that. I just wanted to offer my help no matter what. I know full well that he wasn't the guy for you. Okay, let's forget about it. I'll pick Melody up tomorrow. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Chris. I didn't mean to respond so harshly. I'm sorry. And yes, the last few days have been hard for me. I had to explain to Jacob that his father is dead. He's 3.5 now. He misses his father, but I'm not sure how much he understands that he won't see him again. It wasn't easy. For him or for me. It's okay, Soph. I understand. How did this affect Melody? She tells me she's very attached to Jacob, but she didn't mention that Daniel died when I was talking to her on the phone. She's doing a great job with her brother. And no, she didn't tell you anything because I asked her not to tell. I wanted to tell you myself. I know Daniel is a sensitive topic for you, and I understand why. I just didn't expect it. That you learn about it from the newspapers. One thing I hate is when people sugarcoat what they tell me out of fear of my reaction. It makes me feel like I'm being treated like a child. I understood why Sophie did what she did, but I was angry at her for treating me like some kind of unstable substance that could explode at any moment. Or was I angry at myself for giving her a reason to do this to me? I was hesitant about going to the funeral home to express my condolences. I discussed this with my boss, Mr. Roy, at the end of our meeting on Wednesday. Chris, why don't you go? It will force you to come to terms with this part of your past. You know, reaching out and smiling at someone who has hurt you is very hard, but once you do it once, then it becomes much harder to stay evil and refuse to forgive that person. And from forgiveness comes peace. Mr. Roy didn't get to where he is by being stupid. His reflections on life have always given him a reputation as an excellent listener and advisor. Maybe I should have talked and listened to him more in the past. I arrived at the funeral home late Saturday morning. I didn't tell Melody or Sophie about my visit. The place was moderately busy. The first person I saw was Sophie. She looked stunned to see me. Melody and Jacob were with her. Jacob didn't seem quite sure why he was there. I sat down to talk to him. He simply hid behind his mother's legs. I didn't insist. Sophie explained that Daniel had lost his mother several years ago, but that his father was here. I knew all this from the report of the private investigator I commissioned, but I didn't say a word about it to Sophie. As I approached Daniel's father, at least 2 people stopped me to ask if I was Daniel's brother. No, I'm not his brother. I'm just an acquaintance of Daniel, I answered, smiling politely. Oh, sorry, but you look so much like Daniel. It was really strange. Finally, I approached my father and expressed my condolences to him, introducing myself as Sophie's ex-husband. Mr. Levesque hesitated for a moment, but eventually accepted my outstretched hand. It's strange, you know. You do look a little like my son. You even move like him. But I don't think I'm doing you any favors by telling you that, Mr. Harvey, am I? You must have hated my son with all your heart. Soul for what he did to your marriage? A man stood before me, straightforward to the point of cruelty. He didn't take nonsense for an answer. You know, Mr. Levesque, I have found peace in believing that my marriage was destroyed by a set of circumstances and not by the actions of your son. I bear no ill will towards Daniel. He simply took advantage of the opportunity that presented itself. Can you say that in the same situation, would you definitely have acted differently? Because I, for example, cannot say that. Mr. Levesque looked into my eyes for a few seconds, then took my hand in both of his. These are the words of a wise man. They certainly give me food for thought. I hope life will be kind to you, Mr. Harvey. I had to rearrange my childcare schedule again the following spring because I needed to take a series of short trips to the U.S. I was away most of the weekdays, so Melody was with me most of the weekends. One of these weekends, I promised Melody that I would take her to my dad's friend who had a farm so she could ride horses. Of course, she had been talking about this all week in anticipation. She was almost ready to leave when I picked her up at Sophie's house that Saturday morning. "I'm ready to go, Dad. I'm so happy we're doing this." She was delighted. "What's up, Chris?" Sophie asked me. She looked a little depressed. At that moment, I saw Jacob. He stood in the kitchen doorway, crying quietly. Did I mention that seeing a baby cry always broke my heart? I looked at Sophie and immediately understood everything. We said goodbye and quickly left, trying not to aggravate the situation. We spent a great day at the farm. Melody enjoyed every minute. But it was hard for me not to think about Jacob. Until that moment, I only saw him as a baby, because of whom my family could not be together. But seeing him looking at us with tears in his eyes was another blow. This little boy was never wanted. He was born as an unpleasant surprise. He never had a full-fledged family. Oh, I knew what a caring and devoted mother Sophie was, and I'm sure she did everything just as wonderful for him as she did for Melody. But the poor boy lost his father. He had no one to take him horseback riding. For the first time, I was able to put myself in his shoes and realize that this poor boy never wanted or did anything to cause the problems that came with his birth. He was just a child, for God's sake. He was not the reason for our family breakup. When I returned home the day after leaving Melody with Sophie, I came to the realization that all the questions I had asked myself over the years were about what was expected of me. But did I do it right? Was this really an appropriate response to the situation I found myself in? The problem was that I never asked myself the one really important question. Was I happy? Regardless of what I thought was legal or socially acceptable, did what I did make me happy? Was this impression of saving face more important than the happiness of this little boy? More than my daughter's happiness? More than the happiness of my ex, no, my wife? More than my own happiness? These thoughts haunted me throughout the next week. I was an adult. Maybe it was time for me to start acting like an adult. I found myself back at Sophie's house early the following Saturday morning. Melody would have celebrated her 7th birthday next week. I promised to take her to the zoo. Jacob clung to Melody, cried, and didn't want her to leave. I knelt down in front of him. "Jacob, Melody told you that I'm taking her to the zoo today? Do you want to come with us?" His eyes lit up like 2 bright stars. He started jumping around. "I know Melody really likes elephants. Do you want to see elephants too?" He nodded vigorously, smiling wider than his small face. "And you think Mom will like to come with us too?" I asked. "Oh, I'm not ready to go anywhere, Chris," Sophie replied. "I don't see anything that can't be easily overcome. We can wait a few minutes for the pleasure of your company, can't we?" We spent a wonderful day at the zoo. Jacob ended up being scared of the elephants, but the giraffes were a hit. We returned to Sophie's house that evening. After putting the tired kids to bed, Sophie and I shared a glass of wine in her living room. It was time for the first part of a long conversation. "What happened to Roxanne, Chris?" I looked at her for a few seconds, and I felt it. The moment of truth. One of those moments in your life when you see the bigger picture, when you realize that what is happening will truly change the course of your destiny. "I cheated on her," I answered calmly. Sophie took a sip of wine, but didn't say a word, waiting for me to continue. I told her the whole story of what happened, without looking for excuses or mitigating circumstances. I shared the naked truth, and I added the fruits of my reflections over the past months, leading up to my appearance at Daniel's funeral, and my revelation to Jacob. Sophie listened to the whole story without interruption. When I finished, she looked at me coldly and took another sip of wine. "I wish I could tell you off, you know. I wish I could rub your own dirt in your face, but I won't. There's no point. You've already done it yourself." To her, "I think you've learned a lot over the years, Chris. So have I. It's just a shame we didn't learn all this 4.5 years ago," Sophie said, looking away. "I plan to continue studying, Soph," I replied. I left again the following week. On Monday night, I lay in bed in my hotel room in Atlanta and allowed myself to think about Sophie for the first time in 4.5 years. The next day, I sent Sophie a text message. "Soph, can I take you out to dinner on Friday night? Do you think you can find someone to babysit?" She responded with a series of emojis that answered all my questions. Melody was thrilled when I told her that she would finally become a flower girl. And Jacob was thrilled when we asked him to be the ring boy. It's been a year since that day at the zoo when Sophie and I finally agreed to see if the members of our marriage were still there after all these years. And it seemed that they remained because the fire flared up again in the blink of an eye. I stood in Sophie's parents' garden, watching my bride walk down the aisle again, with her father grinning from ear to ear. All four of our parents were thrilled that we had finally decided to get back together, and I didn't hear one bad comment about remarrying a woman who had a child with another man. Jacob's grandfather died last fall, about 9 months after his son's death. Jacob was left without a father and without relatives on his father's side. I have fully embraced it over the last year. He was a charming child, funny and witty, and he adored his older sister. After the wedding ceremony was over, and before we sat down for dinner, Sophie and I walked over to talk to Jacob. Jacob, now that I'm married to your mom, I have a question for you. He looked at me with a puzzled look. Would you like me to be your father? It took him a moment to realize what that meant. His eyes widened and he ran into my arms. Can I call you Daddy? Yes, of course you can. Of course you can. Do you see this paper? I showed him the official adoption certificate. Sophie and I took every step to ensure that I adopted Jacob. I know you can't read all the words yet, but this tells everyone that I am now your father and you are my son. He was glowing with happiness. Everyone present began to applaud. Sophie, Melody, Jacob, and I embraced as a united family at last. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.